Okay, hello. So good to see so many of you here. Enjoying, I hope, the last day of GOTO Berlin? Yes? Yes, that was very enthusiastic. So my name's Jonathan, this is Steve. We work for a company called Zühlke. I am not even going to attempt the Swiss-German pronunciation of it. Despite the fact that's a German name, we are not German. We're based in the UK. Zühlke is a consultancy. We do various software work. So this talk came about last year. At Zühlke, we have every few weeks in the Zühlke office in London, we do what are called BLTs, or bi-weekly lunchtime talks. And there you can basically talk about anything you like. You can just throw together some slides. And at the end of last year, I don't know what happened. There was nothing at all about ethics in the last, at the end of 2016 that I wanted to talk about. So I just decided to write a talk about it. And as Steve will say, we then took it to Amsterdam, and now we're bringing it here. So please ask your questions. There will be questions, I'm sure. Please ask them through the app. Do not put your hand up, because the last time that happened, it was a disaster. So please ask your questions through the app. I promise we'll have time for questions at the end. If not, come and find us afterwards. I'll be at the social thing afterwards. Come and find us, talk to us. We don't bite.
Often.
Yeah. And yeah, so this talk contains scary stories. It is entirely free of conclusions and easy answers. No software exists in a vacuum, and we, as software developers, have to be humble, we have to be watchful, and we have to make sure that the decisions we make ensure that we can sleep at night. So if, as Daniel Pink says, there are three main drivers for people. You have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Is this? Yeah, the pointer is just working. So this talk is perhaps less about mastery. That's the rest of the conference. This one is perhaps more about autonomy and more about purpose. So, quick quiz. Do you know who this person is? Obviously you know who he is because I've put his name up there. So this is Thomas Midgley Jr. He won a long string of medals. Anyone hazard a guess? If I tell you he invented something, any ideas what?
DDT?
Yes?
DDT?
Not DDT.
Not DDT.
However.
Close. So these, if I say these are all chemistry medals, does that give you a clue? So Thomas Midgley Jr. was the inventor of leaded petrol. So leaded petrol that went into car engines used to contain lead to reduce knocking in the engine and prolong the life of the engine. But the thing was, lead is of course poisonous, and that was attributed to all kinds of horrible things. It led to horrible environmental pollution. People died during the production of tetraethyl lead, which is leaded petrol, and they also, it was also attributed to things like increased levels of violence in society. Like in cities, because the air was so thick with lead, it would result in psychological changes that would then result in increased crime rates. There was a fun thing, which is Thomas Midgley Jr. actually went to participated in a press conference about to demonstrate the safety of leaded petrol, and he poured it over his hands and claimed, I could do this every day and inhale the fumes for up to a minute, and I'd never experienced any ill effects. He later had to take time off work due to lead poisoning. But after that, he went on to do something else. He decided to redeem himself. He went on to work on safe refrigerants, because refrigerants at the time were poisonous and they could also explode. So he was on a team that discovered or worked on synthesizing the first safe, odorless, colorless, inert refrigerant, which was the first CFC, which is responsible for the hole in the ozone layer. It's this wonderful thing, which is someone says he has more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. So, Thomas Midgley Jr., responsible for the hole in the ozone layer and for untold misery through leaded petrol. Did he intend to poison the world? Probably not. But how did he come to do this? Steve.
So, one of the questions is, how do once you start digging, you get into these very difficult or sort of complicated situations. It's good to have some kind of framework to even just sort of begin to think about it. So on the left here we have, being at the Geek Conference, the Dungeons & Dragons Alignment Index. I never actually played Dungeons & Dragons, but I'm sure this is familiar to many people in the room. The middle one is the Hippocratic Oath, and everybody says, oh, this is all about do no harm. Actually, it's mostly about protecting loyalty to the guild, and doesn't hardly mentions patience at all, but that's guilds for you. There's obviously long philosophical tradition. The two on the left are, well, what somebody thought Plato looked like, and Jeremy Bentham, and that's the strand which is utilitarianism, which says what matters is the greater good. Is that even if you do things that are bad for a few people, as long as everybody benefits in the whole, well, that's all right. On the right, you have Aristotle and Kant, which says that what matters is the quality or the intention behind your actions, and if bad things happen, well, there's not much you can do about that. And obviously, as we saw in one of the previous talks, is if you really want to get into this, that will keep you busy for a while. There are in other disciplines, there are proper ethics professionals. This is serious business, so this is the Journal of Medical Ethics, or one of many journals of medical ethics. If you're doing trials and things, or new procedures in hospitals, you have to go to your professional ethicist. I've never seen one of those for software, perhaps we should. But so far, we don't go around cutting people up or using restricted drugs. But there are clear regulations for those people working in safety-critical domains. We do have codes of conduct. This is the ACM, the Association of Computing Machinery, the IEEE have got one as well. It's mentioned over here. There's a lot of stuff in school, and if you go through the right colleges, they do make a fuss about this. But there's a catch. There's, again, unless you're working in a restricted area or a controlled area, for most of us, it's impossible to get struck off. No matter how much damage you do, you might have a reputational damage that people won't hire you, but there's no way to actually get banned from what you did as a software developer. You don't have to pass a test. You can drive before you can write software, all that kind of stuff. Which is probably a good thing, given the state of the industry, because we don't really know what to enforce yet. And what would go in such a test? I'm not sure that's clear. But that does lead to some interesting questions. This is there's a TV series, Silicon Valley, some of you might have seen. And this is one of the participants who's getting, while they were researching. And you'll see that they went around and talked to lots of people. And it's not quite legible, but it says we'd see tech that is scary. I don't mean weapons, but altering video, tech that violates privacy, all that kind of stuff. And we'll bring up our concerns to them and are realizing that zero consideration seems to be given to the ethical implications of tech. It's not even, as you see at the bottom, they don't even have a pat, rehearsed answer. They hadn't thought about it. which is interesting. So in a way of sort of structuring how we're going to think about this, channeling Catherine Kirk, who runs this track for GOTO Amsterdam, who is very strong on Buddhism, it turns out that Buddhism believes that there are these three character flaws that keep people dissatisfied and stuck in the wrong part of their sort of reincarnation cycle. We don't have to believe in reincarnation, but they're still kind of a useful categorization. So you have these three animals. There's the pig, the bird, and the snake, representing first ignorance, and that's bewilderment, confusion, stupidity, delusion, that sort of thing. Attachment is around greed and desire and lust and passion and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's where you put your passionate programmers. And then aversion is good old-fashioned hatred, and just dislike and stuff. So this next section is a bit depressing. It's a sort of catalogue of categorized disasters and things going wrong, which we'll try and sort of clean up afterwards. But the goal of this section is to say, perhaps, look at, here are some interesting things that happened. Perhaps we should start to think a bit more about what we're doing when we're building systems. I think it's yours.
Okay. So, if we split up the 3 poisons, then poison number 1, ignorance. This is mainly about quality and competence. I kind of won't go into this too much. It's been covered a lot by the rest of the conference. To quote Ted Neward earlier, hubris, thy name is software developer. But it's worth a reminder that bad software does have real consequences. So the UK Post Office had a system that effectively, it was a system in post office branches that made up shortfalls, and that actually led to jail time for some people. Night Capital, I think a software deployment went wrong for them. Their system was down for something like 30 minutes. And they lost millions upon millions of dollars. They were gone within 12 months. They were bought out by another company. And Equifax, everybody knows what's been going on with Equifax. It turns out, by the way, that the people, the CEOs or the executives of Equifax are now losing their bonuses, which is good. But that was a bug that should have been fixed. That was a bug that was fixed, and they just did not deploy the update. And then we have things like this. So so it turns out that a Jeep Cherokee, and various other cars can be hacked in rather nasty ways, and strange things can happen to them. You can do things like open the windows, apply the brakes remotely, and so on. Attaching a car to the internet is probably not a great idea, to be honest. But if we go back further in time, anyone know what the Ferret 25 is? Show of hands? A few people. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, the Ferret 25, if we go back to cutting people up, the Ferret 25 was not something that cut people up with like knives and things, but it was a radiotherapy machine. They reused software from an old radiotherapy machine that had a hardware interlock that meant the beam couldn't be turned on without the collimator in place. This one did not have a hardware interlock, and it could be turned on without the collimator in place, meaning that patients could get zapped with far, far over what will be considered a safe dose of radiation. People got horrendously burned and died horribly. And that's just grim. People have actually died as a result of bad software. Steve. Okay.
Actually, the interesting thing about those last two examples, just for a minute, is that both of these are around taking something that works and reapplying it to a different context. The Cherokee the problem with that was that the internal network that's in modern cars, the protocol that was designed for a local network that's not supposed to be connected to the public internet. In fact, one of the guys that did that was also speaking at the last GOTO Amsterdam. And again, the Therac taking software from one purpose, sticking it in another without making sure. So if we go to the second one, this is attachment, and this is where we get carried away with ambition, or that really neat idea that's just obviously going to work. And this is mostly the realm of unintended consequences. So here's a couple of things. Here's kids' toys that, what do you call it, that record messages and stuff, and then someone leaks the messages. And you have to remember that as we stand here today, this used to be run by a government that encouraged children to squeal on their parents. So it can be a sensitive issue. It doesn't have to be a government. One of the things about the assorted disruptive technologies, companies, whatever, is that they also disrupt stuff that we actually really wanted to keep. So one of the things about things like Airbnb, which serves a lot of purposes, but in many parts of the world, there's been a lot of work put in over the decades to stop discrimination against guests. If you're a hotel, you have to take disabled guests, you have to take guests of any race, and all sorts of other considerations. And that's very hard to police when you're allowing people into your house. So all of a sudden, all this, if there's just a few, it's no big deal. But as you scale up and becomes part of the infrastructure, all of a sudden you find that various groups that used to be catered for are now excluded. And then you may have heard that Uber is in the process of appealing the loss of its license in London. And there's a lot of fuss in the papers and the media, the social media and stuff about how, it's nasty bureaucratic authorities trying to put the lid on this great innovation that's going to change the world. But if you actually read the notice that the Transport for London published, it's full of things like, well, they didn't do adequate checking of the drivers and reporting of the drivers, and that they were using the, the grey ball to avoid being checked on by regulators and stuff, which is not stuff you want in a public service, which is effectively Uber is these days. And so, you've got this fantastic idea for a service. We don't get involved in any of this. It's much simpler. Here's a thing for sending money about. And in this case, it's Square Cash, who responded very well, if you can tell from this dialogue. Anything that's used for communicating from one person to another, unfortunately, in the end, can be used for abuse. So who would have thought that you would have to block people from sending you money? But, where are we? Abuse of X, sending $1 on Square Cash and using that as a vehicle as a mechanism for sending nasty messages. And they realized they had to put that in. It's not the sort of thing that you think about when you're trying to make people's lives better. And here's one. Please be careful when sharing photos on social media. They can lead to poachers to our rhinos. Who would have thought? It turns out the bad people are really clever. And they'll take advantage of what's available.
Yeah. Incidentally, during terrorist attacks, the police will now say, please do not post photographs on social media, because that can reveal to the bad guys where the police are. So, enough about that. Let's talk about Grindr. So who here knows what Grindr is? Who's going to confess they know what Grindr is? Okay, I shouldn't be so prudish. We are in Berlin, after all. Yeah. First time I gave this presentation, by the way, I kind of threw it together in around half an hour or so. I just downloaded some press images off the internet. I didn't actually realize that the test user's name was Jonathan and he was a white guy in his 20s. People have asked, is this my Grindr profile? No. I've done many embarrassing things in my time, but I would never, ever claim to work in marketing. So, yeah. So yeah, Grindr is, for the few people who don't know, it's an app for gentlemen to meet other gentlemen. It shows you, I've not got the picture, but it shows you a list of cruising gay and bisexual men who are close to you, and you can send messages and you can send photos to other people. But you'd think that they would have perhaps thought about this. So the thing about a location-based thing is you can use it to triangulate people's location. You can use it to just draw a circle and then work out a potential place where that person can be. And The Independent reported that the Egyptian police were using, excuse me, They were using Grindr to find and arrest LGBT people. For instance, as well, this is not something that is ancient history. The last sodomy laws in the United States were only struck down at the beginning of the 2000s. Chechnya is reportedly doing horrible things to gay men there. Again, it doesn't have to be state actors. As a bona fide gay person, this is the kind of stuff that personally terrifies me. And yeah, it's quite scary. So, here's something interesting. So here's a new AI that can guess whether you're gay or straight from a photograph. Some caveats here. Number one, it was trained on dating profile pictures, which is probably not, it can't just tell, I think it's based on, it was trained on dating profile pictures. Number two, it only works if you are white. And number three, it only works if you are cisgender. That is, the gender you identify as now is the one you were assigned at birth. So this thing, let me just get the figures correct. It has, so it could apparently predict with 81% accuracy for men and 74% accuracy for women. Now, question, does this thing even need to be accurate if there is some person somewhere who wants to hunt down and kill gay people? The fact that all the methods for finding witches were bunk did not change the fact that hundreds and thousands of women were burned as witches. As Hannah Fry was saying yesterday during the excellent evening keynotes, we kind of need, when we do things like this, we need to think a little bit more carefully about what this is actually saying. So this is probably not saying whether or not you're gay or straight, and to say it is, even though it might be a superficial thing, is bordering on ethical irresponsibility. And big data is, of course, it just collects human biases, and there's a real danger that we say that, oh, because it comes out of a computer, it's objective. Well, if it just collates human biases and then reinforces them, no, it's not. There's all kinds of situations. I'm sure everyone's seen the video of the racist soap dispenser. So a white person puts his hand on one of these soap dispensers that has a sensor and it can detect when a hand's under there. And then a black person puts their hand under there and it doesn't detect they're there because they haven't trained it. There was a picture we lost, which was a passport application service that told a man, excuse me, it told a man in New Zealand of Asian descent that he needed to open his eyes on his passport photo. They haven't trained it with an adequate number of people.
So that's the sort of more obviously geeky, techie stuff. But there's a massive problem that's brewing in some countries where we have all these shiny objects, and then eventually even the Macs start to fall to bits. And then what happens to their disposal? This is in Accra, this is a suburb of Accra in Ghana. There are many of these around the world, these electronic waste dumps. I have a house full of cables that I don't quite know what to do with. So thanks to Apple, I have so many dead cables that don't plug into anything more. My house, well, it's not quite this bad, but it's, but you get the point, is I haven't quite put them back into the thing, because we don't really have a clean recycling, or what do we do with this stuff? Not all of it is recyclable. And this is a direct result of our desperate need for faster processes, so we can look at pictures of cats, which is what we do most of the time. And then, yes, there's a mention of Bitcoin this morning. This point pops up from time to time. It's the whole point about Bitcoin that makes it work is that it's expensive to mine. And there are various sort of wild numbers about how much energy Bitcoin is consuming across the world. But it just seems to be going in the wrong direction. And it's nice for a while, but there's some kind of grim hubris just in that. So The final thing, the third section, or the third categorization, is aversion, which is otherwise known as just an unpleasantness and hatred and all that kind of stuff. And some people consciously do bad things. Luckily, not many, but there are some. But most people don't actually believe they're being bad people, on the whole. But then things happen like this. Everybody knows about the emissions fraud. Volkswagen, turns out other companies as well. And there was a lot of spin trying to blame it on a couple of rogue engineers, but I'm not sure I believe that. I don't know if anyone else in this that's extremely difficult to... The question is, how do you get to a company culture where this is seen as normal, as a reasonable thing to happen? You sit there typing, I know, we'll fix this. Someone has to have that conscious decision to do that. And there's a context around that. As Deming says, it's always the system. 99% of the system, 1% the individual. And perhaps they thought that, maybe with justification or not, that the emissions tests were a bit pointless, and it was reasonable to game them because the tests were pointless. You can see, going all the way back to Midgley, you can see probably people there thinking exactly the same. And it turns out that these large companies that we so admire aren't always the nicest people. Big conspiracies or big conspiracies around keeping wages down for their overpaid techies is rather disappointing to hear that it's involved Pixar as well, because you thought they were cool and hip. But it turns out they were in the loop as well. It turns out the money matters. And then, of course, there's Uber, whose image, is, at least in some countries, has been getting more and more toxic. And they've shed the chief executive, and they're desperately trying to pedal backwards to make themselves more, and show that they've changed and that they've become better people.
Then we have stuff like this. As I mentioned, I kind of wrote this talk originally at the end of 2016. I was thinking, WTF, where are my flying cars? I thought we were getting flying cars in the future, and now we've got this. So all kinds of grim things happened in 2016. And the concern about this is that political lobbying is nothing new. But the fact that they can do this, the fact, for instance, that in the UK there are strict regulations on the kind of particle political broadcasts you can put out on television, but there's nobody regulating how much you can spend on Facebook. There's nobody regulating how much you can spend on Google Ads or Twitter or on botnets that display or that force certain messages in front of the eyes of potential voters. The concern about this is how it's not transparent. And again, if we go back to the aversion thing, I'm sure Robert Mercer believes he's saving the world. I'm sure he doesn't think he's a bad person. Interestingly, in the last election in May, it was looking like there was a big upset because so it was thought that it was going to be a Conservative wipeout, but the Labour Party actually came quite a bit back, and now we have a hung parliament. And it looked like Labour had outspent the Tories after that election, which may have had something to do with it. So this is something provided by the New York Times.
Wall Street Journal.
Sorry, the other one. I apologize. Any Americans in the audience, I am very, very sorry. So this is something provided by the Wall Street Journal. It shows you the typical American liberal the typical American liberals' Facebook feed and the typical American conservatives' Facebook feed. Don't ask me why in America liberal is blue and conservative is red. That's just how it is. America. So political polarization in the US is nothing new. It's been getting worse and worse over the decades, but this kind of stuff, this kind of echo chamber that is self-reinforcing can't really be helping. This chap, Maciej Szydłowski, I hope I pronounced that right, He wrote in 2016, "This year especially, there's an uncomfortable feeling in the tech industry that we did something wrong. As in following our credo of move fast and break things, some of what we knocked down were the load-bearing walls of our democracy." Yeah? Does that sound familiar? Who knows what this is? Yeah. So this is obviously the Holocaust Memorial, which is not far away. Holocaust killed 17 million people. All these people. Last year, I visited a Jewish cemetery in Prague, and it took me a while to work out what the plates were that had been screwed onto the wall on one side of the cemetery, until I worked out that Auschwitzim was the Czech word for Auschwitz. And all these plates, it was hundreds and hundreds of meters, all families gone, like that. Hundreds upon hundreds. All of those, each one was a family. It's horrifying. You know what else is horrifying? Is that all this happened before the invention of the microchip. Jacob Bronowski was, so Ted Neward quoted him this morning, he was a scientist and he wrote a television series called The Ascent of Man in the 1970s. He filmed quite a famous sequence where he visited Auschwitz and stood here and said, "This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people, and that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance." Yeah, it turns out that they were turned into numbers in more ways than one. Did you know that IBM ramped up their investments in their German subsidiary around the time of the 1933 German census? There's one of the punch cards. They did this, they ramped up their investments in the internment of Japanese citizens. They assisted in this all before the microchip. What if somebody wanted to do that today? What could they use? Remember, it does not have to be a state actor. Although, even if it was a state actor, is that so unbelievable anymore? Look at the recent election results. America, Poland, Hungary, Turkey. This is scary. So this is somebody who snuck into Seattle's super-secret white nationalist convention. And I'm going to quote this straight from the article. David Lewis, who wrote it, says, "According to my observations, the standard Seattle Nazi is a white male under 30 who either works in the tech industry or is going to school to work in the tech industry." Something's wrong here. Really, really wrong. I'd like to come back to this briefly. Done by arrogance, dogma, ignorance. Remind you of anything? Okay.
Let's just take a little breather.
Yeah. 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 I apologize. That was horror stories, that last bit. But the question now is, what can we do?
So, unless you intend to become a full-time activist, maybe that suits you, or a monk or something. As individuals, our options are limited. Retweeting might help a bit, but it doesn't really solve the problem. So you have to look at some of the things you do have control over. And if we go back to the buzzers and the three poisons, is they have, if you like, antidote behaviors for each of these three poisons. So let's start with ignorance. Is to focus on non-delusion, is to trying to the extent that you can, remove your illusions about the world. And you have to remember, as a discipline, we find it hard to cope with off-by-one errors and naming things. What makes us think we can run the world? So maybe we need a bit more humility and spend a bit more time learning about things outside the latest hipster framework service thing, cloud servicey thing. So here's an interesting case in point. So every once in a while, our current Home Secretary or somebody in the press goes, oh, well, we have to ban encryption because of all the bad people using encryption. And all the geeks go, yes, you can't, but you can't criminalize maths. You know, that doesn't work. We should be free to provide unbreakable encryption because that's the right thing so that people can do what they need to do. Now, here we go again. Imagine we're an encryption specialist in the 30s, and we build a machine for businesses to communicate privately over the public telegraph, like one of these. This is an Enigma machine from a workshop at Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was the UK Codebreakers Centre. If you're ever in Britain, it's worth going. It's an amazing place. And so I was there for a workshop with a colleague of mine, Jamie Dobson, and we used the algorithm, the encryption algorithm, as a sort of for test-driven exercise. And one of the curators brought out, there's a few of these machines left, not many, and brought it out. And all these geeks sort of went weak at the knees, you know, cool, isn't that cool technology? Which is true, but imagine if it had worked a little better, the world we might have lost, and the world would be a significantly different place nowadays, that some of us would either not be here or not be in such a nice position. It turned out, apparently, that the German cryptographers knew that the Enigma could be broken, but they didn't think it was practical. So encryption is obviously a bad thing, you know, we must stop that. On the other hand, here we are. This is cryptography being used to help millions in a place with not much money to improve their lives. And this whole new world suddenly becomes available because they can use encryption to do cheap mobile payments. So again, you know, we said right at the beginning, no easy answers, no solutions. There are no easy answers, but it's worth taking the time to step back and understand. And if there are easy answers for complicated problems like this or complex problems like this, the chances are your alarm bell should be going off, you know, because something's not quite right. And again, yet another. This guy's great. He's got all these talks that he writes up. Approaching the world as a software problem is a category error that has led some of us into some terrible habits of mind. And I don't think it's an accident or coincidence that Silicon Valley has been this center of sort of hardcore libertarianism, because I think it's part of this mindset. And I remember, I was there in the 90s, and when you know there was a sort of deep libertarian pockets, and when it's a sort of a side thing, that doesn't matter. But when you sort of start to get all the money in the world and get control of stuff, then it becomes more complicated. Non-attachment. I think this one's yours.
Yes, non-attachment. It's time for another pop quiz. Who knows who this person is? No one? Okay, it's Robert Metcalfe, famous for Metcalfe's law. There's attributes to him. I'm not sure if he actually came up with it. The value of a telecommunications network is excuse me, I've forgotten how to pronounce words. The value of a telecommunications network is proportional to the square of the number of connected users of the system, or n squared. So this means that many of us end up working in these kind of winner-takes-all domains. If we write that one framework, if we produce that one platform where everyone wants to write it, if we want to become the next Facebook, then it's like a winner-takes-all domain, and the rewards can be enormous. The danger, as always, is with shiny object syndrome. We are as vulnerable as any other industry. I thought I heard something then. We're as vulnerable as any other industry to doing something just because we can. There's always kind of there's never a bad time to step back and say, what are we actually trying to achieve here? There's never a bad time to look back and say, are we going about this the right way? Are we doing this just because we can? So Jen Schiffer, she writes a satirical blog full of fake code articles. Like she's written things such as how Node.js is going to replace JavaScript, or something like that. But she gave a talk at XOXO last year, and she said, when things in real life that sound like satire start to happen, it's way past the time where we need to start reflecting on how we're fostering a society built on hate. We cannot let people advance tech for their own selfish reasons while they pretend they're doing it for everyone. This was on a slide about Peter Thiel, who was involved in PayPal, and how he seems to be extremely interested in injecting himself with young people's blood so he can live to 120. Literally injecting himself with young people's blood to keep him young. As Jen said immediately after this, we cannot all have access to young people's blood.
Right, especially not with falling birth rates.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm reminded about there was a line from Lily Tomlin which says, no matter how cynical I am, I still can't keep up with the world.
Yes, yeah.
Great line.
I'm actually trying to write a dystopian science fiction novel at the moment, and then I turn on the news and think I cannot possibly compete with this.
Right, so the antidote to aversion is non-hatred. The short version of this, I think, is try not to let them pull you into their world, not least of which they're bigger than you, so they'll win. This is a rare and nice story. Mary Beard is a really interesting character. She's a classics professor in Cambridge who's also a bit of a TV personality. She does sort of documentaries and things about the classical world. And she makes no claims to be a glamour model, and there's lots of snotty comments on the web. And she had this interesting case where she got some particularly nasty comments, and with some friends she found out who it was and got in touch and threatened to tell his mum. And so they met up and she talked it through, and in the end they became friends. And she wrote him a reference in the end because he was just being young and stupid. So it is possible. It's extremely rare, but every once in a while good things can happen. But what it also tells you is that shouting each other over the web, particularly over Twitter, it improves Twitter's usage numbers, but it doesn't actually improve the world. So maybe a good start is just to be civil to people. In this room, that's probably not such a strong request. I look at what people say on the web and I don't understand it. I don't understand how anyone can type that in knowing it's going public, but that's what happens. But a good clue is if your response starts with the word actually, you should probably stop typing, walk away for a bit and come back. Some things are improving. This is Berlin. There are now code of conducts all over the place, which there didn't used to be. That's actually moved surprisingly quickly. It turns out that collective action, a bit of campaigning, a bit of visibility can have an effect. So not everything is lost. It is worth trying to make a fuss. And sometimes... I'd like to just go back to this briefly and say, yes, this is great, but it needs to be adhered to. There are certain communities where they do not seem to be willing to adhere to this. I'm not going to name names, but if you know what I'm on about, you know what I'm on about. There are certain communities at a conference that talk the talk but do not walk the walk. So it is critical that if you have one of these, well, it's critical that you have one of these, and it is critical that you actually adhere to it as well, and you actually stick to it. You provide a path for people to address these grievances, otherwise you may as well just not have it. So this is interesting. This is a pledge by US IT workers. So one of our dear friend Mr. Trump's campaign promises was that he was going to stop Muslims from entering the United States. He did not say how, or he didn't really say why either, other than racism. So this is a pledge by US IT workers who, again, they reference IBM collaborating to digitize and streamline the Holocaust and the internment of Japanese Americans. And these people are pledging never again. No, we will not assist with building a registry, for instance, of US Muslims. We will not assist with building a US registry of some other marginalized group that could be discriminated against.
If you've raised ethical concerns and no one's listening, or if they're just happy to sign off of it, then you can just refuse. And this is our last Maciej Szydłowski quote, I think. The one effective lever we have against tech companies is employee pressure. Unfortunately, the enemy is complacency. A workplace free of politics is just one of the many perks the tech industry offers its pampered employees. Yes, it's a valid option to refuse and to walk away. To say, I quit. Yes, I'm an English person standing in front of a bunch of Germans talking about the virtues of leaving. Sorry. Okay. But the point of this is clear. Should we use opposition to resist handing control to a few dominant players? Maybe. But who do we think we are to make this call? Who are we? What do we know? We're just developers. But who else is there? It's complicated. But, you know, the very minimum, we can try. What can we do? We can combat our own ignorance. We can be humble. We can realize that we are prone to hubris. We can talk about it. It should be okay to say, can this go wrong? And we can have a life outside tech. Learn more about the bubble outside tech. Learn more beyond your frame of reference about other people. It'll pay dividends, not just kind of from an ethical standpoint, but it's just good. Non-attachment, just try not to be seduced. Try not to be seduced by that entry on your resume, that entry on your LinkedIn, that new framework or whatever. Track what people actually do with your system. Richard Clayton went into this earlier, a little bit in the cybercrime thing. But track what people actually do with your system and model the threat of hostile users. We often talk about threat modeling applied to security of potential attackers, but we don't tend to think about it when it applies to hostile users, such as, say, an abusive ex or somebody who wants to hunt down gay people or whatever. Maybe we should apply basic threat modeling here. Maybe we should consider that as like a key non-functional requirement before something goes into production to the wider world. And non-hatred. Have a visible ethical charter. Have an ethical charter somewhere and have visible reminders of it. You can always leave or refuse. You can walk away. You can not sign that contract. Your company cannot go for that gig if you think that it's going to involve people being put in peril. And you can just try to be civil to people. I'm not even saying being nice to people, because I think niceness is kind of weaponized a bit. I mean, it's obviously nice if you are a nice person, but at the very minimum, just try to be civil. Don't be that asshole in the first place. I'm sorry I swore, but in the end, you just have to find your own balance. It's all about finding your own balance. Most of us are not going to be monks. Most of us are not going to be philosophers. Most of us aren't going to be full-time activists. Maybe the thing for you is that you should just be a jobbing programmer and just do what you want. And you can't give the emotional labor. Or maybe the thing for you to do is to, it's to accrue wealth and power and then become a philanthropist and set up that foundation and run for president or something. Or it's something else. But the key point we want you to take away is make a conscious decision. And don't drift into a world you didn't choose. Thank you.